Gather around the campfire, kids. It's time to tell the story of the Pod Boys. First, there was Eat Shit Harold, Matisse Van Rossum.
I'm Ben Sheets, and I'm here to tell the story of Squidward's suicide.
Oh, God.
I'm the story that's better left untold. Cleveland Mosher.
Ooh, mysterious. On the subject of mystery, can you guess what we're talking about today? Well, if you listen to last week's episode, probably...
Is it Rise of the Planet of the Apes?
Probably, yes.
What is it?
We're going to be talking about the new film, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, directed by Andre Ovredal.
Better than I would have done.
Director of Troll Hunter, which I forgot last time when I was like, I've never heard of this guy. Troll Hunter is a movie I really like.
I love Troll Hunter. And you know who else loves Troll Hunter? My dad, because that's a great dad movie, and I love it for that.
I like Troll Hunter. I think it holds up pretty well. I watched it not long ago.
It's
a good movie.
It's an absolute Disney ride. It's a better Disney movie than half the Disney movies that are coming out these days.
Well,
I felt like I was on like the little like Viking ride, at Epcot. Fuck me, I love Troll Hunter to bits. Is it nuanced? Is it like a masterpiece? Fuck no, but it's great at what it does.
Well, this isn't a review of Troll Hunter, but it is by the same director.
Pods. Oh, I reviewed it.
Also produced by Guillermo del Toro, and we saw at the end credits that he also wrote the screenplay.
Or the screen story.
The screen story, which...
Probably just like
there were
general
several. He was in between like two
credits.
other writers on that credit also. So
he was at least involved in the writing process.
Mm-hmm.
But this film is, I don't know if you could say based, but more inspired by the series of 3 children's books, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, that were published in the 80s by Alvin Schwartz.
Damn.
Featuring the illustrations of, I looked it up, Stephen Gamble. And I bring that up because if you're like any of us, growing up with those books, those illustrations are still to this day some of the spookiest things I've ever seen in my life.
So I remember very vividly first coming across your copy of it, Tease, when we were kids.
I got him at the book fair at school.
Yeah, God, the Scholastic fucking book fair.
Yeah.
It takes me back. And I remember very, very specifically like you showing the book to me, and I only saw a couple of pages from it, and I was just terrified. And you read The Viper. Like I am the Vindo Viper. Like,
oh,
to vipe your Vindos.
The Vindo Viper.
Like the comedic one and some of the others. And I thought, and you sold it to me as like, no, see, they're not that scary or whatever. And then I took it home and went through the other ones that are scary and saw the rest of the illustrations and had repeating nightmares over them.
Well,
it terrified me as a child.
That's the thing. Like, a lot of the stories that are in those books are like very surface level, like urban legends and
campfire
like
tales.
campfire stories.
They're pretty.
A lot of them are,
straightforward.
ones that you've probably heard variations of at some point. There's the one about the guy finding a stray dog that turns out to be like a rabid sewer rat. The stories themselves are, I would say, nothing terribly special. Some of them are
There's some legitimately spooky ones.
There are some spooky ones. There are some ones that get like weirdly surreal, and I like those. But it's those fucking illustrations that are so like abstract and expressionistic.
Just those ink washes, and they're so messy and textured and drippy.
And they feel gooey, and they're usually not like literal representations of things in the story. They're more sort of ethereal representations.
Oh yeah, like shadowy ink washes, and then like eyes and mouths, and just the stuff that is still terrifying, as an adult, honestly. No, the stories, as you said, are campfire fun stories, which, as a child can still be scary. But, like, as an adult, coming back to the stories themselves, Harold, like, where's my toe, and all the other shit, that's not terrifying. But fuck me, those illustrations, they leave a real mark, because they get to the primal, like, shock factor of
especially like flipping through a book and like reading the stories and then like turning a page and just being confronted with a new monstrosity that you weren't expecting. Yeah, a lot of those stories are firmly imprinted in my brain, even though it's been probably at least 10 years, if not more, since I've actually read them. Yeah, I think my mom probably still has my copies in the house back down in Bama.
I went back to the illustrations fairly recently, about 6 months ago, for a character design I was working on for It Stares Back, our horror game. I looked up a couple of different references for this character design of someone who's been like consumed by a Lovecraftian being. And my main references were Tetsuo the Bullet Man, Junji Ito, and then Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Those illustrations they hold up right next to Ito and all these other like horror illustrators who were not writing for children. Like, mind you, like those are very adult stories.
And that these are very distinctly like children's books. Like the stories are like children's scary stories, and how that got paired with these illustrations, I'm very curious about like what that story is, how they how they sold that to the publisher.
Well, that whole era, like from the 80s up through the 90s and on, you get those circumstances of like whether it's like TV shows or children's books or whatever that are published like more for the financial motivation than the artistic motivation. I don't think this is necessarily the case. And in a lot of those, they sneak stuff by. They got away with a lot. That's really what I'm getting at. Like,
you have to remember too, in the mid to late 80s, the slasher boom was at full tilt, and they had like the Friday the 13th TV show, and all of them were several movies in.
Right.
And, like had toys and whatnot.
It's true. There's definitely sort of a commodification of horror towards children, directed towards children.
Yeah. And it carried on like up until like the early 2000s. I referenced this fairly recently to you guys, but not on the podcast. It reminds me of how like Invader Zim lasted as long as it did. Like these like really horrifying like concepts, but they're packaged for children's entertainment.
Or even like Courage the Cowardly Dog.
Oh yeah, that's another great example. Yeah. That also around the same time, I found to be terrifying.
That's one I can relate to more.
Like, then the reason I really bring that up is because like the illustrations from Johnny the Homicidal Maniac, which were the same person who created Invader Zim, were very similar to Scary Stories. Like that same like ink wash, jagged edges and imagery. It always baffles me. It's like they saw that art and then said, yeah, let's package like something like this for kids.
Well,
like, wow.
I think that impacted Guillermo del Toro as well to want to produce this film and see that it was made. I do think it's a little bit strange that he didn't make it himself, but like it's very much right up his alley, and he's referenced
his fingerprints are on it.
He's referenced the books before in interviews and talks about his inspirations and the illustrations. And what I'll say to the movie's credit is that a lot of the translation is not of the stories themselves, but of the illustrations to a different medium.
I do think they capture the spirit of the books pretty well.
What I really appreciate about this movie is that it's very much about the power of stories, and that sort of being the evil force and ultimately at the end the redeemable force. But it's not just like, we're going to do an anthology of these spooky kids' ghost stories. It's going to be like, well, no, the horror is about the telling of the stories themselves and how they infect people. And there's also, of course, the visual element to that, which they translate. And I thought that was actually a really good approach.
I do too. I enjoyed a lot of those elements. Before we get too far into the film, I had one more point about like the periphery of it, and that was going back to Del Toro. I saw some sort of comparatives with his own work with like Pan's Labyrinth, for instance. Now, I wouldn't compare these films necessarily, but when it comes to children, like coming of age and seeing horror, like there are tying themes that he sort of carried through several of his films.
Absolutely. That's like Del Toro's jam.
Well, the interesting thing with that is where those movies were very adult horror movies aimed towards kids, I feel like this was almost the opposite in some ways.
Like a kids' horror movie that's sort of aimed towards adults.
Or even, like, I think this movie is kind of aimed towards kids with very adult horror at times, you know? And the thing is, I find this...
That's how the books are packaged.
I
so
find this a really interesting kind of subgenre of horror, of kind of horror for kids. Because I think this movie could be packaged towards kids in a lot of ways.
I think
there's no blood, there's no gore.
I think you could comfortably take your kids to see this as long as they don't get too easily scared.
Use
Because
the book.
there's some spooky stuff in this movie for sure, but it is the kind of horror movie that is very easily graspable by like a child's mind.
Yeah.
I would say to any parent, just use the book as a litmus test.
Yeah, that's a good way
If your
to
kids,
do it.
if your kids, that's another thing. Like I know that like we grew up with these books, and there was a generation before us that did as well, since they came out in the 80s. But like I really wonder how much that still exists. Like how are younger kids, like, do they know these books? I genuinely have no idea.
My mom's a teacher, and I do know that they do still exist, and they are still around.
I know they're still in print for
circulated?
sure.
Yeah.
Do her students read them?
I mean, it's not as common as they used to be, but they are still read and stuff.
Right.
That's awesome.
I know they're definitely still in print, but like when I started hearing the buzz around this movie and like seeing the trailers and stuff, I was like, well, this is very much like marketed for people my age and a little bit older. This is for people who grew up with the books.
And to be clear, too, like, I know I preface by saying, like, how much those books, like, shocked me and horrified me as a child, but I'm all for it.
In a good way. Like, that's some of the
it-
stuff that got me into horror to be at the point where I am now. Like, that's some of my earliest, like, fascination with horror came from those books. Like, I read those books over and over and over again, just looked at the pictures all the time.
Oh, yeah, and it's a good way to, like, in a safe fantasy environment, prep kids for the real world.
Yeah.
It's fine by me. Like, I think it's okay to get a little, see this.
Yeah, and I think this movie does a great job of, while it caters in a lot of ways to that nostalgia audience of people who grew up reading them, it does a great job of carrying the torch and passing the torch down to another generation who might just be getting introduced to these, Like, I think these are a perfect entry point to stuff like horror for kids like that, where it's still very spooky for kids, but it doesn't go too graphic or too adult in its themes.
I do remember floating severed heads, like in the illustrations.
Oh, yeah.
Like, it's pretty fucked
there's
up.
severed body parts in this movie,
Yeah.
like... They don't go light on the
But I would say, like,
but it's all
like,
it's all
when we're talking about, like, kids is a
purely-
pretty broad thing. Like, probably like 7 or 8, would y'all say?
Yeah, but I think that an important distinction too is that there's definitely some very grotesque, macabre imagery, but it's all within the realm of fantasy. You can't really like try to make a tie to the real world, and I think that those kinds of movies, like I've brought it up on the podcast before, but stuff like Silence of the Lambs and shit like that is much harder to show to young kids because it relies on the horror of the real world and like knowing that there are real monsters out there, and that is hard to grasp for younger children, I think, and it tends to leave more of a lasting impact. I was pretty young when I saw Silence of the Lambs the first time, and it was definitely a very, very impactful film. But like stuff like this is like, at the end of the day, it's fantasy. It's easy for you to say it's like, oh, it's just a movie. There's not really scarecrows out there turning people into scarecrows.
You can close a book.
Right, exactly.
It's clear.
Let's get into that scarecrow thing a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fine. We can get into
That's
it.
a decent enough segue. I think this movie, when it works the best, it's an anthology movie in a lot of ways. You have a lot of short stories, much like the book, of different horrifying things.
It gave me a lot of Trick or Treat vibes.
Yeah.
It definitely has more of an overarching narrative, and like there's a central cast of protagonists, but the way it treats its horror set pieces is very much the same way. Like they're all distinct and they all center around a self-contained little story, that fit into the larger narrative. And I think you're right that when it really succeeds, it's in those sort of more anthology moments. I think the overarching narrative has a lot of problems.
Oh yeah, I would say
into.
that's probably the weakest element of it. Though I will say, even in that stuff, I thought for the first half of the movie, it was written cleverly enough
Oh,
It was
that
handled
it
pretty
carried
well.
me through it.
Oh, well, yeah, I did not feel that way.
I guess we should just give the overarching idea. There's a group of kids in 1968 who are spending Halloween.
Getting some revenge on bullies.
They end up going to a haunted house of sorts in the town. It's a small town. They kind of cover the story of Sarah Bellows.
Yeah, the child murderer.
They find a secret passage down to the basement where they find this book of Sarah's stories.
The stories start writing themselves. Oh.
Yep, exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
And then out come the spookies. Last podcast, I prefaced by saying I was very concerned going into this film, and I said it again on the car ride over, specifically about the special effects, because as we've already talked about ad nauseum, the illustrations are fucking phenomenal.
Right.
And they're very wet, they're very textured. I hold them in very high regard. And I was very worried because seeing them rendered out in the light of day in CG with whatever other context put around them, it could have been very detrimental. My expectations were entirely subverted, and the monsters were my favorite thing about the film, and I
Same.
loved them to bits. I thought their execution was well, with a big old asterisk. I thought their execution was great visually. They were very textured. All of them like had their own kind of qualities to them and grip, just gooey and even inky at times. I was very pleased,
And
pleased with that.
There's the added aspect of seeing them move as well, which I thought was really well done. That all of the monsters and stuff like had very different ways of moving that sort of suited them. The Herald Scarecrow I thought was particularly well done. Like, I mean, they pulled it straight from the illustration. Like, in terms of realizing that illustration, it looks great, but then when you finally get to see him move, I thought that was really well done. It didn't just come across like I was afraid it would, like a guy in a scarecrow costume. Like, it felt like it was cobbled together and that it was sort of like struggling to move.
The hollow midsection was great.
Yeah.
Like, I thought that was fun. One of my favorite sequences was definitely the jock getting, like, converting.
Oh, turning into a scarecrow?
It was great.
Yeah,
That was
sick.
very visceral. The Foley was great,
sprouting
too.
straw out of his body.
Yeah, you could just
out
hear
of his
all of it, like,
skin.
crinkling and,
Yeah.
like, poking through him, and way more terrifying than, like, any actual gratuity, like, honestly.
Like, that's the
like, a
thing.
straw, like, coming out of his mouth as he's in agony. Like, it was fucking horrifying. Excellently done.
Because in the actual story, the scarecrow, if I recall, skins a couple of people and like dries their hides on the roof of the barn.
Yeah, because he's got that leather-facey kind of look to him.
Right, which is, so I was expecting it to be that, but I think this film is PG-13. I didn't check, I think, because there's no blood.
Can't be flaying people.
Yeah, so that kind of doesn't surprise me. But I thought what they decided to do was pretty creative and also spooky.
Yeah, I thought it worked excellently.
Yeah.
I was thinking about it going in because I didn't know what the film was rated, and I would be curious to know. But I was hoping it was a lower rating. You know, horror for kids thing we were talking about.
Yeah.
That's a good idea. And also because you can absolutely carry through horror into without
It's PG-13.
yeah, without an R rating. Like I'm a big advocate for finding other means than the rated standards for terrifying people. So very pleased with that. Yeah, all the monsters I could gush about.
Well, I find it, much like the book where, like, the illustrations carry some of the shortcomings of the narrative. It's the same way in this movie where, like, the strengths of the character designs and the creatures really carried some of my shortcomings and problems with the overarching story.
Yeah, totally.
Because in a lot of ways, the overarching story is very run of the mill.
Yeah, there's a spooky ghost witch who is killing people with magic. How do you stop the witch? It's in that way it almost feels fitting because it's like the oldest kid's ghost story in the book. Like, don't go in the spooky haunted house. There's a witch who lives there. Magic,
Which is totally fine. Honestly, okay, like, if we're breaking down the beats of the story, like, from, like, location to location and, like, what events occur, largely, I have no problems. I had some strong issues on the motivation of location to location, because literally every location was motivated by going to another place to read something.
Right.
Yeah.
Literally every one.
Scary stories, Cleveland. They gotta read. They gotta read the stories.
They've already got their magic book, and they don't really utilize it that much. It's okay to have like one scene. It's like, okay, cool. We have to read the library records on this and find this newspaper thing. But then they also go to the hospital to find more records on something, and then they go to the other. It's just like it doesn't feel like a detective novel. It feels like the kids are just being brought along, and they don't really have any agency over it. They're just being brought by events to the next thing.
My favorite part of that is there's a quippy one-liner from one of the characters, and he's like, "Oh, this is why I don't read."
Yeah, this is why I don't read books. After they try to burn the magic book and it doesn't catch fire.
I wish that all of the kids had the same level of camp to them. I'm not saying they were all like that archetype, but that kid was great, and I hated all the others. I hated it.
Oh, I didn't.
They were so bland. Like,
I thought they were kind of bland. Like the new kid who drifted in from out of town, he was pretty bland.
What is your opinion on them approaching race issues with that?
I thought it was very generic.
Yeah, they didn't.
With
they
like
didn't,
wetback written on his
they
car.
They didn't say
and stuff.
anything about it.
No,
they just like
they just had the stereotypical bully character, like be stereotypically racist,
calling him a racial slur,
like
and
because bad guy, and then like does the thing on his car. Like it's so blatant. I don't know. Like there wasn't any message to it or anything. Like there wasn't any like.
That was my thing. It's like
it didn't hold any power.
By the end of the movie, it just felt like none of that had a point. And in that case, like, why? Unless you're gonna try to say something about it, why broach it at all?
Right.
Yeah.
And
also like
yeah, and like I have no problem with like that being like a contextual thing, because it was in the time. Also, big point that we should definitely note is that it's set in the 60s. You know, and it's during the draft, and we'll cover that.
I want to talk to you guys about that.
But well, yeah, specifically to answer like the point you brought up, I didn't like how it was introduced or carried through, and I wouldn't have hated him like trying to prove himself point of the narrative.
Well, no, it didn't,
as much if he was a more compelling character and I wanted to like him more. But they give you nothing.
His whole like line of sympathy is that he's an outsider and a bully calls him a racial slur.
Right,
like that.
And also, like, the comic relief kid in the back of the car, when he first introduces him, is like, hey, can I see your switchblade? And, like, just assumes that he has a switchblade. Why does... What?
Because he's a drifter.
Because he's a drifter. Okay.
That's the way I read.
Because he's Hispanic?
That's
because like that's exactly okay. Like that's what I was concerned about. I was like,
that's not how I read it at all.
You read it as like a 50s style like drifter person who has a switchblade.
Right.
That's
how he's a mysterious stranger from out of town.
Because
they find he's been living in his car.
Because it's in the same scene where he's also called a wetback, and unfortunately, and like it's in that same sequence, and then the kid also stereotypes him, not for being like not for being Hispanic, but for being a drifter.
That's the way I read it.
And then also that stereotype is brought to fruition, like because he has a switchblade. He does have a switchblade. Yeah. And I was just like, oh, you know, like, and it made me a little. I felt a little weird about it. Like it's not enough to like call detriment to the film or anything. And I know that like. You know, like Del Toro had a lot to do with the film.
Well,
like he normally is very good about bringing up those sorts of issues.
While we're on that subject, the racial thing and like why bring it up and not having a message stuff. Here's my other question for you guys, and I'll preface this by saying I liked that this film was set in the 60s. I liked the 60s as a backdrop, but why do you guys think they chose the 60s?
Two reasons.
There are a couple. I have a couple.
I think one reason is because 80s nostalgia is starting to get stale.
Yes, that's exact. I thought that they did it because they didn't want to have another Stranger Things ripoff.
Yep. And
group of teenagers, outcast teenagers, solving a supernatural mystery.
I think that's largely unavoidable.
And the second part is so much of their movie is predicated on reading that they can't have internet.
Yes, that's another good point. Yeah. That being said, I'm very glad this was not a modern film. I liked the 60s as a backdrop. I was wondering if it's because like Del Toro was was a kid in the 60s growing up, and that these are like the books weren't out then, but the writer was probably also a kid growing up in the 60s and probably thinking about scary stories and stuff. I'm wondering if there's some kind of contextual thing there.
I'm glad you brought up Stranger Things, because I feel a little differently about it. I think that this film was absolutely considering and utilizing Stranger Things because of those factors, the kids, like facing off against a horror
Right,
and
but
whatnot.
it didn't.
And
But it didn't feel like
it's still a
Stranger
period
Things.
piece. It doesn't, and I'll definitely get into that. But like, it's still a period piece, and it's to the degree where it's same but different. Right? Like,
Sure.
It's well utilized to a degree that you could sell it to a board of executives.
But I mean, that being said,
Like being like, hey, it's like Stranger Things, period.
Well, I mean,
and
I think that was one of the biggest reasons they did not put it in the 80s, though.
And
because same but different.
They're putting intentional separations in there.
the story of like children defeating supernatural monsters is a tale literally as old as time. Like,
right.
Those are
because Stranger Things is pulling off of like the Stephen King or the Steven Spielberg films and whatnot,
Right,
Goonies
but-
and whatnot.
but
And also
even-
it's a genre,
but
and
even older than that, like in mythology and stuff too.
Sure.
Like it's so I think that yeah, because there has been so much of that like 80s nostalgia and like the popularity of Stranger Things and It too, which is also set in the 80s.
and has a similar cast.
And it has a similar cast. I think that a lot of it is probably like, well, we have kids. I absolutely think that the protagonists in this case should be kids. If it had been adults, it would have been a mess.
No, and
We can't do it in the 80s, so when? 60s, I guess?
yeah, and to be clear, like also, I still think it was a good choice. Just because it's sellable to executives doesn't mean it isn't. I was very happy that it was. My concern is that still you can't avoid the Stranger Things comparative, especially when it
Sure.
comes to the child actors, which is where it was by far my biggest issue with this film.
I didn't think the kids were bad.
I thought the
I
main
didn't think they were that bad either.
I thought the main character was very flat. Like,
girl?
her delivery, like for instance, when the Drifter character had like they come out of the house,
She's the straight man, though.
and like wet back is written on this Drifter's car. Her delivery there is just like, "Oh, I'm really sorry this is happening to you," and it's just the driest, flattest thing. Her line where she says like, "The stories are reading you."
Yeah,
It's really
that
flat,
was a bad.
man.
Yeah,
Like,
but that's
That was a
bad.
bad
That's bad
line.
script, though.
Yeah.
That's the fault of the script.
It doesn't help. Like they're
Give me any actor who could say the line, "The stories are reading you," and
no
I
one.
wouldn't
Like,
and I wouldn't laugh.
I
at
agree,
it.
but like, and that's why I didn't bring up that line first. A lot of her dialogue is delivered very dryly.
She's the straight man sounding board character, though. I mean, I will agree with you that the Drifter character Ramon, I think that he is very flat.
Right. Well, I think
and
that
boring.
like just a straight man just reacts to the scenarios around them in a relatable and compelling way. A straight man is not a dry man, right? Like, and she was dry, and like that's my issue.
I mean, she wasn't my favorite, but she didn't bother me. I thought she was fine.
One thing I want to cover quickly before we move on the 60s thing is what is your guys' opinion on using Nixon so heavily?
Yeah, okay, that was another thing that I wanted to bring up, which is what made me tie it to the whole, like, racial thing, is, like, what was the point of the constant references to Nixon and Vietnam? I kept thinking that there was going to be some kind of payoff for that, and there wasn't.
The Drifter avoiding the draft is about it.
Right, but then he decides to go to Vietnam at the end.
Which
Like, what
is weird.
In the establishing shots of the town, we even see the Nixon posters that somebody has turned the X into of his name into a swastika.
Yeah.
And they go to see the old Haitian lady who was friends with the witch girl or whatever, and her daughter's like, Tricky Dicky, what kind of name is that for a president? And then the sheriff later is like, yeah, it's election night, you're gonna owe me $5 when Nixon wins tonight. And it's like all of this stuff, and then we find out that the Drifter has been on the run because he's a draft dodger, because like he even says, like, they sent my brother home in pieces. They just send people there to die. It's like, yes, we know this. Yes, Vietnam was fucked up. Absolutely. And then at the end, after they stop the witch, he gets on the bus to go to fucking boot camp to be shipped away to Vietnam.
Right, which means that, like, the Jenga man was right? Like, calling him a coward? And it's like, no, that's not cowardly. Like, fuck the draft.
Right, he's like, I'm afraid Sarah's gonna, in my story, she's gonna see I'm a coward. And, like, the girl even says, like, no, you're not a coward. It's like, what is the message of that?
I was.
That he should have gone to
Vietnam. He was getting on the bus, like, because he was accepting the draft.
There was a soldier at the door to the bus with a clipboard asking his name. Yeah, he was for sure. He was for sure going off.
That's dumb. That's
what is
dumb.
the message of that?
There isn't one, and
they make a big deal talking about, like, how fucked up Nixon was, and, like, people go off to Nam to die, like it's a useless war. Things that we all know now, but then they still send one of the main characters off to Nam at the end to die. Is it supposed to be that through dealing with these supernatural horrors, he's conquered his fear?
He's not scared of death
anymore. And he's not scared of death anymore, so he's going to go off and fight the Viet Cong in a criminal war where he's almost certainly going to die?
Yeah,
because the Jenga man, like, the monster that comes after him, like, repeatedly calls him a coward.
Right.
And it's just like,
and
so the monster was right. Like, is that what you're saying?
And
like,
it's a man in pieces who all of the pieces move individually with a mind of their own.
And his brother was sent
home in pieces. Like, what? I get that that's supposed to be him facing his fear, but the moral of that story should not be, I'm not afraid anymore, I'm gonna go off to Vietnam.
Yeah, and die like my brother did. Like,
right.
You know, like what the fuck? It made little to no sense. I will say, up until the end part, I liked the fact that he was a draft dodger.
Sure.
I thought that was a good character arc, and that was one of the few things I didn't see coming. That was nice.
Yeah, no, I think that makes it relatable.
But how they closed that arc was garbage.
Yeah.
Yeah. No bueno. And just, universally, I felt little to nothing for the characters who were being chased by these monsters, and I felt like it kind of detracted from the monsters a little bit, because you're not getting an opportunity to be concerned for these characters, and that was instead replaced with jump scares, which is...
There are a lot of jump scares in this movie, yeah.
Is the editing is probably my least favorite thing about this movie. I was not a fan of a lot of it. There were a lot of great moments during the monster sequences that I thought were well edited, but not when it comes to the jump scares.
Other than the jump scares, because I mean, jump scares are their own thing. I don't think you can say a film's editing is bad because of jump scares. What other than the jump scares bothered you about the editing?
The dialogue sequences, it was really rushed. It felt there was no pacing for any, like, conversational moments. They were already moving on to the next scene, like, in some cases while they were still discussing it. For instance, there's a line where they're reading the newspaper about it. Their friend who was dressed up as Polnachella at the beginning has been killed or whatever, and he makes a joke. And before there's even, like, a moment to breathe to really get, like, the girl's reaction, he just says, oh, well, our friend would have really liked that. But he's, like, already just finishing up the joke. Like, there isn't a second to, like, let that line sit for us to take any of that in. There's no time, and it's on to the next scene. And, like, there's no breathing room in that movie. Like, if it had just slowed down a little bit, like, given me some more with the characters. The problem is that the characters were, like, flatly delivered, and so they were just trying to, like,
that's the interesting thing to me is, like, I didn't think the editing needed more space to breathe, because during the movie I was just waiting for them to get to the next set piece. Like, I could care less about the overarching story.
Yeah, I was there for the spooks.
Yeah, and I kind of disagree that, like, they needed to give it more time to breathe. I think it was paced pretty decently well. If anything, I think they could have cut more of the overarching story out. And
I mean, yeah, because it was Garbo. Like, I agree. I was also, like, wanting the next monster to come up, but the sequences between the monsters were, like, just felt so, like, rushed and weird. Like, why does she call her dad just to fucking traumatize him and then not ask for a ride back? And the police chief is just like, oh, cool, your dad's not picking you up. Guess I'll lock you in a fucking cell. Because that makes sense.
Well, because she's established that people in the town growing up have made her believe that she's responsible for her mother leaving as a child, and she calls her dad because she's afraid that she is going to die because of the spooky stuff, and that she's going to disappear, and her dad is going to think that she ran off just like her mom did. thinking that her dad has already been abandoned, calling him because she knows she can't go home to him because she has to see this out, but that if something happens to her, that I didn't run away, I wouldn't abandon you.
Yeah.
Like,
so then, like, what does the dad do?
It's a little bit.
He calls the police. Like, he goes and tries to find his daughter.
But that's not. That's the script, though. That's not the editing. That's the script.
True.
The problem's with the script.
I'll give you that.
It's not with the editing. The problem's with the script.
Yeah, the problem's with both, from where I'm sitting. But yeah, no, that is absolutely that specifically is a script issue.
It's a script problem. Yeah, realistically, her dad probably would have immediately called the cops and been like, "Hey, my daughter just called me. She's being really weird. She's talking about dying. Like, we need to look for her." And the cops would immediately say, "Oh, she's here. Like, we got her." Yeah, that is absolutely how that scene would go. I'm definitely not arguing that.
Yeah, and like, you could do anything to like make me think that it's not going to go that way.
The motivation for her calling
come up.
The motivation for her calling her dad is there. Just the way that
she handles it.
Just the way that the film concludes that series of events is nonsense.
Yeah, and also the fact that like the dad like doesn't have a reason for telling her why the mom left.
I don't give a shit.
Yeah.
I don't need to.
Right, but the daughter, like, if the dad can't give her a reason, like, she's gonna keep thinking it's her. That's a shitty dad.
I mean,
I think she does know is the thing. I don't think she's in the dark.
Well, she
blames herself.
He even says on the phone, it's like, you're not the reason your mom left. I've told you that before. So like he has told her that, and maybe he doesn't know why the mom left. She could have just up and left. Like, people just do that sometimes. The point is that the whole subplot is not necessary. I agree with you, but the motivation for her calling her dad is sound based on what they've set up. The problem is, why does it matter that her mom disappeared when they were kids? Like, how is that relevant to the story overall?
Right, and
it's
so
not really.
the purpose,
I don't care. Get me on to the next spooky.
Exactly. So from a writing perspective, the purpose of that scene becomes her calling her dad and traumatizing, and them just traumatizing each other in the scene moving on. That's not character development. That's not movement. That's just a sequence that occurs that doesn't have any application.
It's incomplete character development.
Yes.
They try to give that subplot as a sympathetic character development for her character. I don't think she needs it. This is a scary movie about scary stories. Get me on to the scary things. Just have the characters be fun vessels for me to view this. The movie's almost 2 hours long, and I think they could easily cut 20 minutes out of it.
Sure. By taking moments out instead of handling them in a rushed way that feels sloppy. Like,
sure.
And that's a huge part of it, right? Like, her mom leaving her could have well played into an overarching like aspect of the narrative. She has abandonment problems. She's concerned about losing people around her, from her own means, which she does. She blames herself for her friends disappearing and whatnot. But that can have like some degree of like give her some degree of motivation with like the monsters and stuff at the end, having to do with the banishment of the monsters, with having to do with her general fear of being abandoned. But that's never really played up like when the monsters like come for her and her sequence. That doesn't really tie into that. So she takes agency by like writing her own story about that, which almost ties in. Like, that could have been a way for her to say like, hey, I never knew why my mom left, but I can fill in the gaps and I can like make this a point and like rewrite my own narrative that way. And like it almost works for that, but it's not played out that way.
I think it's a little bit half-baked, but I would say that her abandonment issues and her blaming herself for things does play into her story at the end, because they put her in the position of Sarah Bellows, of the witch.
Yes.
Who we learn was very much like the Kennedys. She was the embarrassment child that they locked in the basement and never let out of the house, and ended up blaming for the poisoning of a bunch of kids in town that was really from the mercury from the family's paper mill, whatever. Yeah. But that's why at the end when they go back to the house, like...
Which we never see, by the way. Sorry to interrupt you.
No,
but like, there's a lot of that in the movie, and that's a huge point.
Yeah, it's another really
like,
half-baked
there was
thing.
so much in the film that's just offhandedly mentioned, that's never resolved or referenced in any way other than just by like dialogue, and it felt really cheap to me.
The whole
just being like, oh yeah, she, you know, like with the paper mill, whatever else like that. We never see a paper mill. We never like get any relevance with that. Like we don't learn too much about the kids who were killed beforehand, if anything, and we don't see any of it. That was very weird to me. Like it's in dialogue while other things are going on, and there's no correlation between that and the actual narrative. And especially in a story where it's about stories coming into reality, you don't get that much of it with so many of these small little nods and conversational points. It feels kind of fruitless.
The whole Sarah Bellows mystery is fucking stupid and my least favorite part of the movie. But my point is that when she is put into the shoes of Sarah Bellows and she is like reliving that moment as Sarah when she's hiding from her family and they drag her down into the basement and lock her in a windowless room, you know, that does play into her like being betrayed by your loved ones, like her mom left, and being abandoned, you know, put and isolated, you know, sealed away. So I think that idea is there. The execution leaves a lot to be desired, though. I really, really hated that scene where she, like, comes face to face with the ghost of Sarah Bellows, and she's like, I'll tell your story that you're innocent and that your family was responsible for the poisonings.
So she like writes a book report.
It on so she writes a fucking book report about it, and that breaks the curse.
Right, and
I think that is insanely dumb.
It's insanely dumb because it comes out of left field, and again, that specific point has nothing to do with her mother abandoning her and the backstory there. Like the way that she takes agency has nothing to do with that.
Like I said, it's half-baked.
Here's the thing. Here's
I
what
see
you
what
could have
they're
done instead.
going for, but it's all half-baked.
Here's what you could have done instead, right? There was an orgy of evidence like in her room that she loves horror. Then she loves writing horror stories. She likes to write.
We see that she does.
She's like a journalist.
She has a typewriter with horror stories that she's writing, and her friend tells her you should submit your stories to the school paper, and she says no, people wouldn't like them, they're too weird.
And that's it. And then we move on.
Yeah.
Like I needed more. I needed more with that.
I mean, I agree. That should have been better developed.
It's that, and that's it, right? And then we go the entire 2 hours of the film, and then it just concludes with that. That's not carrying through a theme.
Well, it's to set up the end of the movie.
Right. Like, and that's the purpose it serves, especially when it's her sword. It's how she like slays the beast.
Right.
She writes this story. All you have to do is like for certain moments, like just have her comment on the writing. You know, like have her make that more of her character. Like have her address things, you know, from a writer's perspective.
I don't know if I'd want that though. Honestly, like
I mean, that can be very poorly done.
I get that like a lot of the overarching story was half baked, and I agree. But I will say, for a movie called Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, I was hoping they would leave the audience more in the dark with the overarching story and not go into the details even as much as they did.
Like with
you know,
like with the pumpkin kid in Trick or Treat,
yeah,
where there's sort of that connecting through line,
shell
but it's a
stories
mystery.
Are fine, you know,
it's a mystery
like
in and of
all
itself.
anthology movies have shell stories, whether it's Creep Show or anything else. I would be more okay if they just had cut most of that and went from story to story and maybe had bits and pieces, but have them much less or just character driven.
Yeah, or like any of or just more of those nods and references in the dialogue, which is already overburdening, like either come to fruition or be like let me see something. You know, like to some degree, but specifically with the family, I fully agree with you. And I want to make that clear. Like when I brought up the point with like when they're talking about the family a lot, like the drip feed of information is well dripped. Like not knowing if she's responsible for it, at what time, and how we receive that information. Especially like I absolutely adored the phonograph, whatever you called that.
The
like,
wax cylinder.
The wax cylinder sequence. I thought that was really good. I love that audio. It was very spooky. I liked how Snidely Whiplash, the brother, sounded.
Oh my God.
What I didn't like like is that the characters during that like took so long to recognize that he was the bad guy. It's like in the first time you hear his voice, he's like, "Well, Sarah, maybe we'll put you back in the basement." And then like he says like several more things and like electroshocks her once or twice, and the girl's just like, "Oh, she's so bad." And I'm like, can you hear him? He's a villain. Like, what the fuck?
She doesn't remember what she did. Yeah. Here's my ideal way to play out this story, I think. Because I think we can all agree that the biggest problem is they put way too much effort into the framing narrative, and that it falls really short by the end because it's so half-baked.
Yeah.
I think the best way to do this would have been in the first 15-20 minutes of the movie, set up a cast of characters, kids, you can still have the bully and everything.
Sure.
They find the book, our protagonist takes it home, it's Halloween night, and she's reading it in her bed, and as she's reading it, then we cut to one of the characters that they've introduced, and the story that she's reading happens to them, and she goes on to the next story, and it cuts to the next person.
Right.
And then and so she, she reads through the whole book, and then it's like, ooh, that's spooky. Well, time to go to bed or whatever. And she wakes up the next morning, and like the news is all over, like all of these people in town have died or something. And then roll credits.
Have you guys ever watched any of like the Jim Henson Storyteller series for TV? Reminiscent. Like that's bringing up a lot of like old memories of that. We'll have to pull those up at some point.
Well, yeah, even stuff like Tales from the Tales from the Dark Side movie, like revolves around like reading stories from a book, and it's such an ideal way to do an anthology.
You can
movie.
even keep the written as they come thing for the last story. Just keep it for the last one. Don't make it the focus point.
Yeah, sure. She gets to the end, there's some blank pages, and as she's looking at it, it starts to write itself, and then something spooky starts happening, and then maybe like right before she dies or something, we cut to credits. Like anything like that. That would have been the perfect framing for it.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I think all of the individual anthology bits are great. The scarecrow and with the bully,
the spider zits.
The spider zit.
Great.
Oh my god, that made me that
gave me the heebie-jeebies.
Yeah.
I'm very glad that they reduced the amount of screen time that the spiders themselves got, because that was like, that would have been awkward. It was all about the pussy thing on her face, and that's how it should have been. That was great, because like CG like crawly bugs are always like just the worst in movies. They always feel really fake.
Well, yeah, as soon as they burst out of her face, the lights go out.
Off. Yeah, and we don't see much of it.
Which is the way to handle it.
Yeah, agreed.
Like that was great. I loved that sequence.
I did too.
To wrap up on like the last thing we're talking about too is like, Ben, I agree with what you're saying. I think the reason like I'm so bothered by the main actors is because they got as much screen time as they did. So I had a lot of time to stew over how much I didn't like it. And yeah, just more of the spookies, like you were saying, Tease, like more of the anthology part.
The anthology bits work
because if you're gonna have, I could see it really going either way, and the film just met a bad middle. Either have less of the kids, or if you're gonna have more of the kids, go the Stranger Things route, subvert some character expectations, give me some three-dimensional characters that I don't mind being on the screen when there aren't monsters.
Yeah.
Like, that's the thing. Like, Stranger Things, for instance, has all of the same archetypical characters in it, right? It's got the bully, it's got the nerd, it's got the Gus character from the Goonies. They all have those in them. They have the comic relief guy, etc. But the difference is Stranger Things has a habit of subverting those expectations over those characters. Steve ends up being one of the protagonists, right? He's not just the jock bully. He starts out that way, but he develops. And I know like we have a whole Netflix series of Stranger Things for that character to develop, but that character served no purpose other than to just be that archetype.
I think for this movie,
but it goes that way for all of the characters. The girl as well, like she doesn't really develop that much or change. She just goes through the motions. You just either have less of it or have it be better done.
Well, here's the thing I see it as. I can understand the comparisons between Stranger Things, but that's not the movie I was comparing a lot of the times in my head while watching this movie. The movie
I didn't think about Stranger Things
making
at
the
all.
comparison to is the recent Goosebumps movies.
Oh, yeah, which I haven't seen those.
R.L. Stine is played by Jack Black, and they are very much kids' movies and very light for the most part. You know, they still have their minor spooks or whatnot, but like comparing the two, this movie was so much more maturely handled and handled its characters with so much less condescension and treated them like complex characters with motivations. Even though
the motivations weren't necessarily the best handled, but they,
I mean, compared to Goosebumps, where they actually have motivations to speak of.
Well, and that's the thing is, like, I wasn't particularly bothered by the characters in this movie. They all felt very generic, but in a movie called Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, I'm expecting generic characters. I'm expecting the stars to be the spooky, scary stories. Like, that's what I'm expecting going into this movie, and I think that the movie falls short in trying to focus too much on the characters rather than letting the scary stories do their work. I think the best way to handle this movie would have been to try to make like a modern take on like Creepshow or something. Do it like that. I could draw a lot of comparisons to Trick or Treat while we were watching it. I had very few problems with it for at least the first half of the movie. It's when it started getting really hackneyed towards the end that I started being like, I don't like where this is going. And then in the last 15 minutes where it was just laughably bad.
For instance, the blonde character, the one who was dressed up as Paul Nutella at the beginning, what was his motivation? What drove him? What was his purpose other than to die to the toe monster?
He's the doubter.
Right.
That's his archetype.
His doubt has no basis in motivation. Like he is the doubter because the film like needs that archetype in it.
He is the doubter, and he's like the logic nerd of the group. You know,
right. He's the doubter because if you're looking at it as if the film is set in reality, just about anybody would doubt it.
Oh yeah,
because you would too if you were in the situation. You would try to rationalize. So that's why there always is the doubter in these movies, and he's the second one to die. So like his motivation as being the one who doubts is fine for me. Like he dies to the toe monster, and like that's what he's there for.
I just like he goes to the fridge, he opens it up, and there's a big red pot in it, and he's on the phone with his mom, and he's like, yeah, I'm just gonna eat the stew, it's in the pot, and the mom goes, I didn't make stew, it's not in the pot. And he goes, well, someone did. And then he goes and he puts it on the counter. And then his friend over the radio says, don't eat the food. And he just eats the food.
Well, yeah, he's fucking stupid.
Yeah. He's a moron. And then he deserves to die. And then that whole lead up for the sequence of him dying isn't scary.
Horror movies are full of dumbasses who deserve to die.
They're pranksters. We were introduced to them as pranksters.
Yeah,
so, but like you can have pranksters with a heart. Like you can have pranksters that you care about.
Yeah, but if you're screaming at that, it's fair to understand that
he would think that his friends are playing a joke on him.
Or a prank on him, you know?
Yeah.
I don't think that's crazy.
I think I would buy that too. And I mean, goddamn, it's a fucking horror movie. Like, horror movies are full of characters who serve no purpose other than to die. In horror movies like that, I think that's okay. And I think this is one of those horror movies. I was invested enough to care enough about the characters for moments to be tense, but not enough that I was like, oh no, don't kill this character. It's like, nah, I want to see the scary stories. I want to see the spookies.
Yeah, I think you're right, and it's fine to have your cannon fodder characters, the ones that are killed off because you're there to see the kill scenes,
right,
and whatnot. It is a personal preference of mine that I would much rather have a character that I'm invested in or that has been built up three-dimensionally so that when they are ripped apart, they're ripped apart in 3 dimensions.
Well, I think...
And not just like
it depends
jump
on
scared.
It depends on the movie.
Because I felt the film, like that's his death sequence, I felt his getting killed off via jump scare was all it could have been. Like all they could have relied on there was to startle me instead of me to feel any dread over the scenario or anything else because I didn't care about the character. So they had to just try and play the old startlement trick on me of having build up tension, play for quiet, until you think monster's gone and then make startling screechy noise. And those images
it's that kind
I will say the core of your argument is part of the problem I have with this movie is I think at first they were trying to do an anthology, but they were like, oh, we need some complex characters, we need some characterization.
We need a Stranger Things, but different.
They found a middle ground. A bad middle ground.
And it just doesn't work. You know, either pick one or the other. Right. I would have preferred anthology personally.
Totally, yeah. This is a movie for it because it's based on anthology books.
Yeah,
like it's about the individual self-contained scary stories, and when it's doing that, it is excelling. It's when they then halfway through the movie try to be like, well, no, we need to have it be about our protagonists defeating the evil monster or whatever. That's where it gets fucked up and stupid.
Yeah, I think
lame.
Either could have been good, but I agree fully. Like, anthology would have been my preference.
Your source material is anthology, so go anthology, I think. And like the stories are short, so it's not suited for an anthology TV show. It's perfect for an anthology movie. Give each story 15-20 minutes, do a handful of them.
Yeah.
And there you go. Have a very, very simple, bare bones overarching narrative that maybe like Trick or Treat becomes the final story. You know, the overarching narrative becomes the final one. I think that would have been fine. It's like, just don't try to do that and then midway through decide like, well, no, we need to make our characters complex and we need to make people care about these characters. Like, nah, just give me more of the spooky stuff.
Yeah, it works really well in Stranger Things. Why don't we do that?
I fucking absolutely hated the very ending.
Yeah.
With her voiceover and saying like, Chuck and Augie are still gone, but I just know there's a way to get them back. And I think the book holds the answer. And then it's her and her dad and Chuck's sister, the spider bite girl, in the car driving somewhere? What was that?
Like, why is she still has family. Like, she still has like a mother and a sister. Like, why is she with them? It makes there's no reason for her to be with them. There's no characterization played out between the two of them.
Other than that, she was involved in the spooky stuff, and that's literally the only connection.
Right, but like even then, like
it's fucking stupid.
Our protagonist, like she isn't the one who comforts her. Like during the spider sequence, like they have little to no interaction with each other. Like they could have built up anything. Anything.
Was that supposed to be like a play to set up a sequel?
That's what I thought.
100%.
Yeah.
But what is that sequel gonna be? It's gonna be so bad.
Yeah, like
if so, fucked up if true.
I hope if they do a sequel, they just abandon the overarching story.
Same,
and
dude.
Just do an anthology.
I think it's gonna depend on the reception of this movie. I mean, it has been doing well. I did see that it's currently certified fresh on Rotten Tomatoes.
Yeah.
I didn't see the score.
We didn't
I'm okay with that.
predict this one, but it is at an 80 on Rotten Tomatoes.
Yeah,
that's fine.
Yeah, I think this movie had a lot of strong suits. We spent most of this episode talking about the problems.
Because there's a lot of them.
There's a fair amount of problems.
There's still plenty to talk about with the monsters, though. I wouldn't mind going back into that for a little bit. We don't want our poor listeners just listening to us complain all the time.
No, by all means, then what's something that you liked that you wanted to talk about?
Holy shit, the hospital sequence.
Oh, I thought that was great.
Yeah,
that was probably my favorite part.
It was definitely mine.
I love how they set that up with him talking about like having these recurring dreams of
the Red Room.
I didn't like that.
Oh, I liked that.
I didn't like that
that
because Ollie he just offhandedly mentions that when they're doing something else in a different scene. Like he's just like, "Oh, I had some dreams about this," and have me saying like, "Is there like a deleted scene? Like, did I miss something?" Like,
well, no, he says
because the character doesn't seem hounded by it or anything. Like he just offhandedly mentions at one point like, "Oh yeah, this bad dream about this thing one time. Hey, let's go talk to Spooky Witch."
Well, no. He said he had another dream where this happened, and he concludes that by saying, "I'm afraid that when my story comes, it's going to have something to do with that." I thought that was pretty good because it's vague. He says, I had a dream that I was in a red room and this like really fat, pale lady said like, this is an evil place. And so when they go into the hospital and they're like, oh yeah, the records you're looking for, that's in the red room. And he's like, oh no, I don't want to go in there. I don't want to go in the red room. it turns out that RED is just an acronym for like records
and evidence depository,
something like that. But he runs off because he doesn't want to go to the Red Room with them, and he ends up being caught.
The Red Room comes to him.
The Red Room comes to him.
That's fine.
I thought that was great.
great.
I think setting it up with talking about the dream is the way to do that. So there's this impending threat of what is the Red Room.
I'm definitely not asking for like a dream sequence of him having beforehand. I definitely don't want that. Like, just putting that on the record first. But it's the delivery of it that I did not enjoy. They're on the porch, they're ringing the doorbell, and he just quickly spits it out, and they move on. They move into the next scene. That's an editing thing that I was talking about. Like, they're on the way to doing something else, and there's no pause given. Like, and the actor doesn't have an opportunity to convey that feeling until they're in the hospital. I didn't buy it from the character. Like, he just kind of just like, oh yeah, I had this dream, and it was rough, and like I didn't get anything from him emotionally. It wasn't very driving, and it felt like telling and not showing.
I mean,
when they showed,
I really
great.
didn't mind it. It was just basic setup. I think they even do a decent enough job of subverting, with the records and evidence depository.
Yeah, I liked that too.
Like, he was dodging the Red Room.
And he wasn't actually at all.
Yeah.
I mean, I think another way you could have set that up is having him bring up that dream when they're at the hospital and they say, oh yeah, the records are in the Red Room. And he's like, oh, the Red Room. I had a dream that I was in a red room and there was this monster there. Like, that probably would have been a better place to approach that. But once again, that's not editing, that's script. That's another script issue. There's just a better place to put that. But I thought that creature design was fantastic. Another direct translation of one of those illustrations that I thought was really effective. And him running from it, and every hallway he turns down, it's there just a little bit closer. I thought that was awesome.
It kind of gave me a Silent Hill vibe almost.
Oh, yeah, that very much gave me a Silent Hill vibe, that creature.
I loved the moving shadow that like sets up everything too. I wish there'd been some payoff with that. That's supposed to be Sarah Bellows. Yeah. She's there controlling. That's what gave me the Final Destination vibes. Because in some of the later Final Destination movies, there is kind of like a shadow. You'll see like a shadow moving when one of the characters is gonna die, when it sets up all of the complex Rube Goldberg things. So I'm like, that's very Final Destination. I thought that was fun. I didn't think it was particularly effective. It didn't bother me. I thought it was just like, ooh, fun, spooky, the shadow of death is looming, No, that was rad. And just the design of the Red Room monster, very terrifying.
Definitely had Del Toro's hand on it.
Quite. That whole sequence really did feel like a Del Toro moment. And I liked it the most because it was the only monster sequence that didn't have jump scares. It was actually paced out properly. It was the impending doom running from it, but you can't get away from it. Right. I liked that a lot. And he keeps turning, and it's always there, but it's not like played up as like a startlement or a jump scare every time, because the monster does all the work for you, and all the monsters do. I think that the jump scares were arbitrary. That's the other part. Like, they were scary enough on their own.
Jump scares actually work pretty well for this type of movie. I mean, I didn't have any problem with the jump scares. I thought some were better than others.
Like her hiding from the brothers at the end was just a direct repeat of the guy under the bed. They just did the same thing twice.
That was a bad one. The one where he pins the Jenga man to the truck and it like falls apart and then it pops up right in front of the screen again. I thought that was really stupid.
I actually kind of like the cheesiness of that one.
I didn't mind that one.
That one did not work for me. But I thought a couple of them were pretty okay, all things considered. This is the type of horror movie where you can expect at least a couple of jump scares.
And it's the type that it doesn't bother me.
And all things,
I'm not expecting the witch in this movie.
No, I wasn't either. I felt like the monsters did enough.
All things considered, the jump scares were relatively inoffensive to me. I was surprised by how much of the monsters appeared to be practical. There's definitely
yeah.
some CG, but there was quite a lot of like Harold, like the scarecrow was a physical prop. I think that when she has the big like the welt on her face, the red spot, some of it was CG, but I think at the end there where it's like really big and she's like pressing on it, I think that was makeup.
It was CG where it needed to be. It's
And,
my favorite use of it.
I even think that some of the Red Room monster was practical too. I don't think all of it, but like when she like reaches him and she like embraces him, like that looks physical. That didn't look like CG to me. And even the Jenga man, like some of that is obviously like a contortionist wearing a costume, like crab walking. And I thought that I was really impressed by that because based on the trailers, I thought it was going to be all CG. I was like, wow, there's a fair amount of practicals in this.
Yeah, they use CG to enhance a lot of the time in this
Which
movie,
is the way to
is
do it.
a great way to do it, yeah.
We got the Jenga man, we got the Red Room, the toe monster. The toe in the soup, the way that's played up and it rises, it was very, very gross.
I thought that was cool.
Excellently well,
and when
very well executed.
When he first runs into his room, and it cuts to outside and there's no music and we just see that corpse like round the corner and just like start, and all you can hear are like her shuffling footsteps. I thought that was pretty spooky. I agree the jump scare thing with him being pulled into the shadows under the bed was a pretty fucking corny way to end that.
I think the idea was great. I love like him getting pulled like through the depths under the bed, and when they pull the bed back,
there's just the
nail marks. I thought it was very weird that they just walk into the room and immediately pull the bed back. Like they had no reason to think it was under there. And that's another like rushed editing thing. I'm just like, wait, what? They didn't stop or like look anywhere else. Like what's going on? And they just throw the bed back because that's where they need to look. And I'm like, all right, fine. But I mean, the idea was cool. In
fairness, in his room, there weren't like they checked the closet. There weren't a lot of other places that he would be if he was in the room. So I mean, I buy them pulling the bed back, but you know, whatever. I'll start the rating. Overall, I thought it was a solid movie. We spent a lot of time like really picking apart the few problems that it did have. For an almost 2-hour movie, I was pretty solidly enjoying it for about an hour and a half. So, which leads me to believe that if they cut about 20 minutes out of this movie, I think it would be pretty great. But as it stands, the framing narrative gets really convoluted at the end. Not great. Where it really thrives is the little anthology bits, the actual scary stories themselves, the design of the monsters pulled from the illustrations, really top notch. I thought this movie was pretty solid. I'm going to give it a 3.5 out of 5.
I agree with a lot of that. I think this movie does a great job capturing the spirits of the book, even for its shortcomings, you know? Like, I think in a lot of the ways the books are similar, where the illustrations and the visuals
totally
carry some of the shortcomings of the narrative. And I think we did harp on this movie a lot during the review, but I would advise people, if you're curious, go see it. It's definitely worth checking out.
I would say it's a fun popcorn horror movie.
It's a fun popcorn horror
movie.
movie. It's a good movie to take the family to, even, you know. It doesn't condescend and go kiddie with it, you know. Yeah. It's still spooky even for adult viewers, which I appreciated quite a bit.
But it's probably not going to traumatize your kids.
Exactly. And I think for that it works well. I wish structurally it would have been a little different, but even like the structural problems, I really didn't have as much of a problem with it as you guys did. I thought it was pretty solid. I'm going to give it a 3.5 out of 5 as well.
Cleve, bring us home.
Sure. I was not pleased or impressed by the actors in this front to back. I thought it was a poor middle road between schlock and sincerity, and that there was a lot of flat delivery. You know, it would have been much better off if they'd gone either full on anthology, or if you are going to have focus on your characters, to have them better written and more fleshed out and dimensional, other than the same archetypes I've seen over and over and over. All that said, though, fuck, the monsters are awesome. They're great. They're very well executed. And, even with a jump scare delivery, it's well worth it. Those are incredible sequences, but the glue holding the film together is not ideal. So I'm going to give it a 3. I'm going to give it a 3 with like a recommendation. I was hedging towards 2.5, but those monsters are pretty fucking great. I have a lot of problems with this film, but what I liked a whole lot.
Well, that'll be an average of 3.3 out of 5 pods for Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Next week, it's Ben's pick, and we're talking about Maximum Overdrive.
I pick cocaine. I am so excited. I am so excited to talk about this movie.
I've never seen Maximum Overdrive. Cleveland
I don't
seems
know
to have
why
some
you're
pretty
so
strong feelings against
this.
it.
Like, it is...
I'm being melodramatic.
It is one of a kind. It is a very special movie. I have a special place in my heart for it.
I've read the short story that it's based on, and Trucks in one of his short stories, his anthology series, and I liked that story a lot. And all that I know about the film is that it was the first and last film that Stephen King ever directed. And and he's very ashamed
much
of
like
it. And that
Charles
has me,
Lawton.
yeah, that has me intrigued. Well, yeah, but I don't think Charles Lawton was as ashamed of his film for the same reasons. I'm curious to see, and we'll go with it. But yeah, it's largely melodrama. I'm fine seeing the film.
I'm excited. I'm
hesitant.
Cocaine era Stephen King is some of my favorite of his writing, and I'm curious to see what Cocaine Stephen King can do as a director. I will
say Maximum Overdrive is the perfect name for that movie. That's all I'll say.
And I'm ready to go into Maximum Overdrive, and I hope you guys are ready to join us next week for that. But until then, if you're excited for next week's episode and you liked this episode, then go on to Apple Podcasts or wherever else you get your podcasts and leave us a 5-star rating and a nice review. We would love it if you'd take a few seconds to do that. We really appreciate it. You can follow us on Twitter at PodPeoplePod. For, general tomfoolery. And also on Letterboxd at letterboxd.com/podpeoplepod for the list of all the films we've talked about on the show with our average ratings and links to those reviews. And you can also check out our hallowed halls of the golden pods on Letterboxd. You can follow me on Twitter at Mr. Van Awesome. Although at the moment, I maybe wouldn't recommend it. Maybe wait a week or two. I'm going through some stuff right now.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Mr. Sheets. If you like True Detective Season 1, follow me.
We'll leave it at that.
You can find me tweeting for Light Arc Studio. At Light Arc Studio, tweeting It Stares Back stuff very occasionally. I'm about to start tweeting up some more stuff. Probably a little after this podcast has come out. You'll see some stuff about our new map editor for It Stares Back. Very excited about that. And if you're keen to know more and learn a little bit about some slow, dark, spooky, meandering astral horror, check out It Stares Back. Join our Discord. Say hello. We're pretty talkative in there. Hang out with us directly. Even talk about the podcast.
You can find the link to that, to our Discord, on our website at lightarcstudio.com, studio singular. You can find It Stares Back on Steam. Still only a cool $6, but it won't be forever. Pick it up now. You'll get all future content for free. Yeah, that should be everything. Thanks as always for listening, and throw some more logs on the fire and get out the marshmallows.